I'm Elliot Peters, and this is What Was That About? A show that tries to get to the point of every movie. This week we're talking about the first big-budget superhero major motion picture. It's Superman the Movie. You can expect a quick plot refresher, a couple deep dives, a tangent or two, and at the end we'll decide once and for all, what was that about? All that and more after this quick intro. Hi everybody, welcome back. Sorry for missing last week. I'm doing some traveling to see some family this summer, and some last-minute travel plans got in the way of me putting this episode out sooner, but I'm glad that we get to talk about Superman today. If you're watching the show on YouTube, then you will notice that I am not in either of my usual spots. I am in a secret third location because I'm traveling, and so I'm recording this in an Airbnb right now. Of course, there's the new Superman film series, which was rebooted just last year with the James Gunn adaptation. That movie I was a huge admirer of, but it's not necessarily something that I hadn't seen before. It's certainly more comic accurate, especially in comparison to the modern depictions of Superman that you'll see in DC Comics. But the messaging, tone, and characterization of its central hero, played by David Cornsweet in the 2025 film, seemed to me to be deeply indebted to the film that we're going to talk about today. In fact, if you look back on the last 30 plus years of superhero films, or the idea of a superhero film as a distinct genre separate from action, it really all comes from this movie. And I think now is a good time to talk about superhero movies because we're sort of in a retrospective era. In my opinion, I think the heyday of superhero movies was like the 2010s. Since the COVID-19 pandemic and the fallout in critical reception of specifically like Marvel Studios films following Avengers Endgame, those movies don't really capture the same audience that they used to or that they did at the height of their power. And so talking about superhero cinema during the 2010s was difficult because we were living through it, but now we can kind of look back on the last 30 years and go, what was going on there? What led to those movies really taking off? What was it about general audiences that were primed for those movies at that time? It's really a larger conversation that I'm sure that we'll get into through future episodes of the show, but I think Superman is a really, really great place to start. The James Gunn version of Superman appears this week in Supergirl, which is a quasi-sequel about Superman's cousin and her adventures in space. I'm looking forward to the movie. I've heard middling reactions to it, both critically and through fan discourse online. So who's to say whether or not it'll be up to snuff? But I'm still looking forward to it as a good time at the movies. But, of course, the Superman character is no stranger to these kinds of lukewarm fan reactions. Superman has had a very rocky history and several divisive depictions. None of the sequels to this first of Christopher Reeve's appearances were ever as well received as the debut, and he appeared in, if I'm correct, 3 more movies. Superman 2, which had a very troubled production. The film was kind of taken over by Richard Lester, but there also exists a Richard Donner cut of the film, which most fans agree is superior. Then there's Superman 3 and Superman 4, both of which also starred Christopher Reeve, and neither of which were ever well received. And then it all was restarted again with Superman Returns in 2006, which, while it's an entertaining return to form in some respects, got middling reviews and was considered an overall bland entry into the larger Superman canon. Superman Returns is tough to look back on now because it was directed by Bryan Singer, who is a very controversial and unsavory person in the history of comic book films, accused of various crimes, and the film also stars Kevin Spacey. So if you're not aware of Kevin Spacey's controversies, kind of a similar story there. These are not good people, not good men. So the movie is kind of interesting to look back on for those two reasons, although Brandon Routh, who plays Superman in that movie, is beloved by a lot of fans of the Superman character. It's very indebted to Christopher Reeve and the original characterization of him in this 78 film and its sequels. And then, of course, there's Zack Snyder's take on the character with 2011's Man of Steel and its subsequent installments, Batman v Superman and Justice League. These were all incredibly divisive, trading in the bright colors and hopeful tone for a darker, more aggressive, and decidedly very, pubescent approach. Snyder is a filmmaker with a cult following, If you're at all passively interested in comic book movies as a subgenre, then you've definitely heard about him. And his Superman movies were not necessarily to my taste, but they were very, very much to the taste of a certain subset of comic book movie fans. But that's maybe a story for another time. Today we're talking about Superman from 1978. This movie was directed by Richard Donner. It was written by Mario Puzo, who was the screenwriter of the Godfather trilogy. Additional writing was performed by David Newman, Leslie Newman, and Robert Benton. The cinematographer was Jeffrey Unsworth. The cast includes Christopher Reeve, Gene Hackman, and Margot Kidder. It was edited by Stuart Baird, with music by John Williams. Up front, I want to talk a little bit about the history of this character. Superman's first debut, his conception to begin with, and the major developments that kind of contributed to the Superman that we meet in 1978. Because this character is an archetype. He has become an archetype in modern cinema and in modern pop culture. In many ways, including a recent interview with Christopher Nolan, superheroes have been compared to the characters of ancient myth, in that they are popular characters that get adapted into different adventures over and over again by varying people, and their stories are passed around and discussed and changed and adapted. And they're larger-than-life people with mythic powers. And that's very much the approach that Richard Donner and Mario Puzo took with Superman in 78. They wanted to make this pop culture icon into a myth and approach it like an epic. So while later depictions of superhero characters in cinema almost seem to be apologetic about the pulpy or supposed low art connotations of their comic book origins, Superman doesn't do any of that apologetic stuff. It really commits to the character, to the verbiage, to the Krypton, and all these larger-than-life ideas that could be seen as very silly. It commits wholeheartedly to them. And I think it is precisely because of that sincerity that the movie works so well, especially because its main character is a very, very sincere individual. It kind of has to follow his lead, you know? So let's talk about where Superman came from. The following is from the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History. Unique and interesting source, the reason for which will become apparent very soon. Superman, the popular comic book superhero, was created by writer Jerry Siegel and artist Joe Shuster in 1933, while both attended Glenville High School. They were high school students. They came up with this character. Their creation became known worldwide, inspired numerous imitation superheroes, and brought fortune to many, but Siegel and Shuster enjoyed none of that fortune between 1949 and 1975. That's just a few years before the film came out. Native Clevelander Jerome Jerry Siegel was writing for the school newspaper, the Glenville Torch, when he created the Superman character. His collaborator, Toronto native Joe Shuster, worked up the initial drawings for the comic. Together they entered the new comic book business in 1936, not with their Superman character, but by writing and drawing other adventure strips for New Fun Comics Incorporated. In 1938, publisher Harry Donenfeld paid $135 for their Superman strips, which first appeared in the premiere issue of Action Comics in June 1938. The great popularity of the character soon led to Superman Magazine, a syndicated newspaper comic strip, a show on the Mutual Radio Network, animated cartoons, a 15-episode movie serial, 2 feature films, and a 104-episode television series in the 1950s. With Superman appearing everywhere, his creators slipped into obscurity and poverty. By signing a release form when they sold their strips to Donenfeld, Siegel and Shuster had lost all rights to their character, and perforce agreed to work exclusively for Donenfeld for 10 years, at $35 per page and half the net profit. There are a lot of stories like this when you look back at comic book history. A lot of people getting ripped off, a lot of very creative and intelligent artists falling into obscurity for decades, many of which never got their dues. Siegel and Shuster are, I think, a rare instance of original creators who eventually were able to step into the limelight and say, hey, we created this is our work, and were hopefully rewarded or compensated accordingly for it. When their contract ran out in 1948, they sued to recover the copyright. They received a $100,000 settlement, but lost the court case, their jobs, and any further involvement with Superman comics. Siegel continued to work on various newspaper comics, but the legally blind Shuster had great difficulty finding work. By 1975, with public support from the National Cartoonist Society and the Cartoonists Guild, they pressured Warner Communications Incorporated, owner of national periodicals, for financial compensation. In December of 1975, the corporation agreed to pay each man $20,000 a year for the remainder of his life, and to include their bylines on all future productions featuring Superman. Their creation, with their names, returned to the screen in the highly successful Warner Brothers film Superman from 1978. So, while it ended up being something that they really had to work for their entire lives, Superman is now finally acknowledged as their creation, and you'll notice their names at the beginning or at the ending of any film or any cartoon or any type of story that uses the Superman character. That's the meta-narrative. That's the story of how Superman came to be. But what about within the context of DC Comics? How did the story of Superman develop over time? The following is from the official DC Comics blog. Superman's very first appearance in Action Comics devotes a single page to his origin. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster originally had an extended sequence detailing the Man of Steel's origin, but it was ultimately cut for space. The details of Superman's backstory are brief, establishing the bare basics. Readers see a panel of Krypton during its final moments, but the planet is unnamed. A caption tells us that the planet is dying of old age, so a scientist puts his son in a hastily devised spaceship, which is then launched towards Earth. The scientist is also unnamed. The narration tells us that a passing motorist discovered the child and dropped him off at an orphanage. We then see a panel of baby Clark Kent lifting furniture at the orphanage, much to the surprise of his minders, followed by a panel where an adult Clark is seen showing off his powers. This seems to imply that he grew up in the orphanage. The one-page origin story goes on to state that everyone from Clark's unnamed home planet had the same super strength he did. Siegel and Shuster show their work by saying that ants and grasshoppers can lift things larger than they are and jump great distances. If you were a kid in 1938, that explanation was all you needed. In 1939, McClure Syndicate commissioned a Superman newspaper strip. This gave Siegel and Shuster a chance to expand on the origin and use some of the scenes they had to cut from Action Comics #1. There's an extended sequence on Krypton, which is named for the first time. Once again, we're told that the planet is full of Supermen. Jor-El and Laura are seen for the first time, and we learn that Superman's birth name is Kal-El. Jor-El learns that Krypton is going to explode and tries to warn the Council, but the Council doesn't believe him, forcing Jor-El to plan his own contingency. This exchange between Jor-El and the Council would become an essential part of the origin story in subsequent retellings. Earth is chosen as Kal-El's destination because of its ability to support life. The passing motorist, mentioned in Action Comics 1, is seen rescuing the child from the rocket. This could technically be considered the first appearance of Jonathan Kent. However, the rest of the strip once again implies that Clark grew up in an orphanage. When Superman got his own title, his origin was expanded once again. Jor-El and Laura aren't seen, but we get more panels focusing on Clark's childhood. The passing motorist is given a wife, and we learn that their family name is Kent. The wife is identified as Mary, but the husband isn't given a first name. In a key difference, the Kents still turn the baby over to the orphanage, but quickly return to adopt him. This story establishes that Clark got his moral compass from his foster parents, a key theme that would carry over in subsequent retellings. However, the panels depicting Clark's childhood show the young boy growing up in a metropolitan city, rather than a small-town farm. When the Kents pass away, Clark makes the decision to become Superman. In 1940, the Man of Steel began starring in his own radio drama. The serial's script took some interesting deviations from Superman's previously established origin. For example, Krypton was in the same solar system as Earth, on the other side of the sun. When baby Kal-El's rocket arrives on Earth, he emerges as a fully grown man, already in a Superman costume. He takes the name Clark Kent because a young boy suggests it to him. Needless to say, these additions to the origin didn't stick around. In 1942, George Lowther, one of the writers on the Adventures of Superman radio show, authored a prose novel about Superman. Although the book has been mostly forgotten today, it made some very big lasting contributions to the origin story. The novel renames Laura to Lara, and changes the spelling of Jor-El's name. The book presents the Kents as farmers for the first time, which would go on to become a defining aspect of Superman's background. In the novel, Clark's powers slowly manifest as he grows up. This is in contrast to previous versions of his origin, where Clark has all of his abilities as a baby. This idea was abandoned in future retellings, but would later be adopted again for modern versions of the character. 1944's More Fun Comics, issue 101, introduced a retcon, establishing that Clark operated as Superboy during his youth. The origin story is retold again, and in the process, Jor-El and Lara are seen in a comic book for the first time. Previous appearances were in radio, newspaper strips, and the prose novel. Previous depictions of Krypton presented the world as a race of supermen. But this comic was the first version of the story to establish that Kryptonians were powerless on their homeworld. According to this version of the story, the Earth's gravity gave Superboy his extraordinary powers. This change addressed why the Kryptonians didn't use their superpowers to escape their planet's destruction. In 1948, Columbia Pictures produced a 15-part Superman serial. This is the first version of the origin where Mrs. Kent sews Clark's Superman costume, using material from the baby blankets found in his rocket. 1949, Smallville is named for the first time. Prior to Superboy issue number 2, the setting of Clark's childhood years was inconsistent. In fact, some early Superboy stories erroneously stated that Clark grew up in Metropolis. In 1949 Superman number 61, Superman learns about his Kryptonian origins firsthand as he travels back in time and observes Krypton's final days. As a time-traveling phantom, Kal-El is unable to interact with the world around him, but he's able to observe it. He learns his birth name, who his parents were, and where he came from. Previously, these facts had been known to the readers, but not to Superman himself. 1960 introduced the idea that Superman gets his powers from Earth's yellow sun, while his home planet of Krypton orbits a red sun. This became the permanent explanation for Superman's powers going forward. And then finally we arrive at 1978's Superman the movie. In addition to being a groundbreaking superhero movie, 1978's Superman also added some key elements to Superman's origin. The movie establishes that the S on Superman's chest is a family crest, representing the House of El. The film also places Smallville in the state of Kansas for the very first time. Superman presents the Fortress of Solitude as a giant crystallized structure containing a living recording of the Man of Steel's parents and all of Krypton's history. In this version of the origin, Superman learns about his heritage from a living recording of his father, Jor-El, which probably makes more sense than time travel. The relationship between Superman and his ghost dad would become a key part of the mythos. So, Superman the movie contributed a lot of really pivotal and iconic elements of the Superman mythology that are kind of taken for granted these days or are believed to have come from the early comic books. And it's really the language of cinema that allowed for those story elements to exist in the first place. We need all these different spaces for the audience to learn information about Superman as a character, and so the Fortress of Solitude and the recording of Jor-El become very, very important. And it's really interesting that the explanation of the S on the chest has really taken off. I think every subsequent film adaptation of Superman adopts that idea. The S stands for something on Krypton, and it just happens to look like the letter S on Earth. But it's Superman's relationship to his birth father that brings me to a very strange bit of trivia regarding the production of Superman the movie. If you're watching the film, you'll notice that in the credits for the picture, Christopher Reeve, although he plays the main character, the title character of the movie, is the third name to appear on screen. The following is from No Film School, which is a popular online resource for independent filmmakers. In just 12 minutes of screen time, Marlon Brando, who played Jor-El, walked away with a staggering $3.7 million salary, plus an 11.75% cut of the back end. When the box office receipts were counted, Brando's total haul ballooned to roughly $19 million. The story of Brando on set is not just about the money. It's also about how hard it was to get this expensive performance out of him. At the time, he had famously gotten sick of acting and refused to memorize any of his lines. The production, therefore, had to hide cue cards across the set of Krypton so Brando could nail his performance. And as the legend goes, Brando even read his lines off a prop diaper. During the scene where Jor-El places the infant Kal-El into the escape pod, the script was taped to the baby's swaddling clothes. Brando peered down at the kid not just with fatherly love, but so that he could read his lines. You hear stories about Marlon Brando's cue card reading in conversations about The Godfather and also Apocalypse Now, which also both came out in the 1970s. I think in his own words, he kind of claimed that it allowed him to have a very fresh performance, that it was as though the words were occurring to him in real time, so that they didn't look rehearsed or memorized. Of course, everyone around him claims that he was really just being very lazy, and that's certainly what it sounds like. He had reached such insane levels of fame, and he was beloved and renowned as this master of the acting craft, and so he kind of found some ways to get away with some really unfortunate behavior, and that really is very unprofessional, isn't it, to have your lines written down on the diaper and to be reading there. It's really very silly. But as I mentioned, Brando wasn't the only one above Christopher Reeve on the call sheet. The honor of second billing was conferred upon the more famous and more bankable Gene Hackman, who plays Lex Luthor. We'll talk a little bit about Hackman later, but he also had some very interesting demands about the way that he performed his character and the accommodations that be made for him on set. Christopher Reeve never seemed to let that bother him. He didn't speak ill of these actors. He did give an interview on a talk show one time where he talked about Marlon Brando's kind of dissatisfaction with acting. In a very respectable way, though. He always seemed to carry himself with a lot of poise and a lot of respect for the craft and for his co-stars and the people that he was always working with. He seems to have been a real treasure of a human being. And to give you a little bit more insight into Christopher Reeve and the man that he was, I'd like to read an excerpt from On the Legacy of Christopher Reeve by Carl Harmuller Jr., who was a Superman superfan. Christopher Reeve may have had third billing in Superman, behind Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman, but he was the star. The then unknown 24-year-old was chosen from hundreds of actors for a role that was not exactly coveted. The producers had considered giving the part to Robert Redford, Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, Clint Eastwood, Sylvester Stallone, and even to Charles Bronson, Burt Reynolds, and Chris Christopherson. Those big-name stars who were offered the part all turned it down cold. In the late 70s, no serious actor would be caught dead in red, yellow, and blue tights. Prior to Superman, every costumed hero brought to life was played with one note, whether it was the square-jawed seriousness of TV's Superman George Reeves, or the slightly more round-jawed campiness of Adam West's Batman. This is a side note coming from Elliot, but I do love Adam West's Batman, and he catches a stray here that I think is undeserved. But I digress. Nobody had ever made a big-budget superhero movie for the big screen. It just didn't seem like a movie anyone could take seriously. Luckily, Richard Donner could. When the director, then best known for The Omen, came on board, he brought a new sensibility to the project. He eschewed the campiness in favor of a more respectful but not overly reverent tone for Superman. He wanted to play it straight, and part of the key would be casting someone the audience could buy as the Man of Steel. To Donner, that meant casting an unknown. Christopher Reeve was a struggling young actor, with a slight resume and an even slighter build, but Donner and casting director Lynn Stallmaster saw something in him that rang true. He was able to say lines like, "I'm here to fight for truth, justice, and the American way," without eliciting too many snickers. Once the suits at Warner Bros. Were convinced that he could fit the red boots, Reeve underwent an intensive physical regimen with bodybuilder David Prowse, who played Darth Vader in Star Wars, to achieve the look of the part. But it wasn't Reeve's 6'4", 225-pound physique that made him so convincing as Superman and Clark Kent. He brought a true duality to the role, making you believe not only that he could bend steel with his bare hands, but that Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen didn't recognize that Clark and Superman were one and the same. Reeve claimed to base his Clark on Cary Grant's bumbling Dr. David Huxley from the 1938 screwball comedy Bringing Up Baby, a movie which I, Elliot, absolutely love. Hunching his shoulders, raising his voice, getting caught in revolving doors, and using colloquialisms such as golly and swell, Reeve played Clark Kent as a slightly pitiable everyman, a very square peg who just couldn't seem to fit into the world's round holes. This is a side note and a tangent from the essay which I've been reading from, but Bringing Up Baby is an excellent example to use here because screwball comedy is a specific subgenre of comedy that kind of fell out of style in the early 50s and late 1940s. His Girl Friday is another example of a Cary Grant screwball, and they are movies that play directly with gender dynamics. I'm going to get into more detail about why I think that Superman is a great example of kind of a new take on a screwball comedy, but in traditional screwballs you have men with more effeminate character traits and women with more masculine traits, and you play those two characters against each other and let their personalities clash to create the plot, and from that you get a lot of really subversive and brilliant gender commentary while also creating some very good romance. And I think that that's precisely why Clark Kent and Lois Lane work in 1978's Superman. Then, when the horn-rimmed glasses and the blue suit came off to reveal the Superman uniform underneath, everything fell into place for Reeve. But unlike the actors portraying superheroes before him, Reeve played Superman with something that had previously been lacking: humility. Reeve was smart enough to know that the iconic costume of Superman would do most of the acting for him, so he played it really low-key. This was not a god standing with puffed chest, arms akimbo, and brow furrowed, lording over the inferior humans he could conquer if he desired. This was simply, as Superman answers Lois Lane when, after being rescued by him for the first time, she asks, "Who are you?" a friend. So let's talk about this subversive masculinity of Superman as a character. We can find who he is and what his approach to masculinity as a character really is from his two father figures. He has two different father figures, and the movie uses both of them in very interesting ways. The first example we'll talk about is Jonathan Kent, Superman's adoptive father, the small-town Kansas farmer. So in Clark's youth, early on in the movie, Jonathan takes Clark aside and says, "Been showing off a bit, haven't you, son?" Clark walks over and joins him in the yard. He says, I didn't mean to show off, Pop. It's just that guys like that Brad, I just want to tear him apart." Jonathan says, "Yeah, I know. Clark says, "And I know I shouldn't." And Jonathan says with total understanding, "Yeah, I know, you can do all these amazing things, and sometimes you think that you'll just go bust unless you can tell people about it." "Yeah, I mean, every time I kick the football, I can make a touchdown." Jonathan says, "That's for sure." Clark goes, "Every time." Jonathan says, "Yeah." Clark continues, "I mean, is it showing off if somebody's doing the things he's capable of doing?" Jonathan says, "No." Clark asks, "Is a bird showing off when it flies?" Jonathan raises a finger. No. Now, you listen to me. When you first came to us, we thought that people would come and take you away, because when they found out, the things you could do, and that worried us a lot. But then a man gets older, and he thinks very differently, and things get very clear. And there's one thing I do know, son, and that is you are here for a reason. I don't know whose reason, or whatever the reason is, but I do know one thing. It's not to score touchdowns." They laugh. Clark says, "Yeah, thanks, Dad." After this scene, things take a turn in the plot, and Jonathan dies from a heart attack. It is very pivotally a death which not even Superman can save him from. But Jonathan's wisdom here is in advising the young Clark Kent to find a purpose, find a driving purpose in his life, and that his special abilities are not necessarily something to be hidden, but they are something to be used. They have a use. And it's implied here that Clark is here on Earth to help people, to look after them, to protect them. And it's specifically because Clark's father dies so soon after this. It's a loss that Clark suffers that he wishes he could have done something about, and his powers don't allow him to help his father in that moment of anguish he loses. And a lot of people claim that Superman isn't really a dynamic character because he is invulnerable and incapable of suffering loss, but this is an example of exactly what makes Superman an interesting character. He is able to suffer loss interpersonally. Because he is invulnerable physically, it does not mean that he is invulnerable emotionally. And so when stories find ways to put him through his paces and challenge his beliefs, he becomes a very interesting character because you get to see what happens to hope and what happens to kindness when times get very hard. That's what really good Superman stories are about, and that's why I really like the character. But now, in contrast to Jonathan Kent's teachings, we're going to take a look at what Superman's other father figure has to say about his purpose in life and about what he's supposed to do. And that means that we have to go to Krypton, just before it explodes. The camera is close on Jor-El and Lara and the baby as the parents stare at their offspring. Baby noises are heard. Lara kisses their child on the head as she tearfully hands him to his father. Jor-El holds his son, troubled, and briefly kisses him on the head, too, before placing him in the lower module of the rocket ship. Now, I know as I read these lines, it's going to be difficult for you to hear them and not think about Marlon Brando reading them off of the kid's diaper, but bear with me here. Jor-El says, "You will travel far, my little Kal-El, but we will never leave you, even in the face of our deaths. The richness of our lives shall be yours. All that I have, all that I learned, everything I feel, all this and more I bequeath you, my son. You will carry me inside you all the days of your life. You will make my strength your own. See my life through your eyes, as your life will be seen through mine." The Son becomes the Father, and the Father the Son. This is all I can send you, Kal-El. This little speech is beautiful because it both claims Kal-El as his son very definitively and emotionally, but it also grants him individuality. It says, you are a product of my life and my experiences and my thoughts and feelings and emotions, but you are your own man, and you have no choice but to become your own man without me there, and you will see my life through your eyes as I see yours through mine. And that individuality, that free will, gives Clark Kent the ability to make a choice about how he wants to live his life. The choice that ultimately a different father is going to be able to coach him through making. It's really poetic. It also, I think, makes sense why Marlon Brando agreed to play this role, because he's essentially like a godlike figure, and Clark Kent is kind of Jesus in this moment, both of which are, if you're looking at the origin of Superman, kind of additions that this movie makes to the mythos. Superman as a Christ-like figure is visible throughout a lot of Superman media, but mostly after this movie. This movie kind of is the first to position him in that role. But so Superman is sent to Earth with the weight of his family's legacy on his shoulders, which is a very masculine thing to bestow upon a child. And he arrives on Earth and develops these supernatural abilities, and is coached by Jonathan Kent towards finding a purpose for them. And that purpose ultimately becomes the protection of other people. Again, another very masculine trait. But these are very positive representations of masculinity, right? Because they're devoted to the good of other people. They're in service of other people rather than selfishness, which I think Jonathan Kent likens to scoring touchdowns, right? Clark could just score touchdowns every single day of his life, but he's here for a better reason, a more important reason, and that is to take care of people. There are two very important foils to Superman's characterization. I briefly touched on this, but Lois Lane, I think, is a brilliant subversion of femininity in the style of a screwball comedy. She is in a man's line of work, the news business. She wears a very masculine wardrobe in most of her scenes, and she has a very masculine personality. She is abrasive and blunt, and it's all very charming, and I love that the movie doesn't try to scold her or put her down for these things. Instead, it lifts her up. It's a part of who she is, and it's part of what makes her attractive to Clark Kent, and these are things that are directly borrowed from Screwballs, especially if you look at something like His Girl Friday, which takes place in a newsroom. Lois Lane is that hard-hitting female journalist that gets stuff done and will hunt for the story. At the end of the day, that's what makes her admirable as a person. And then there's this other foil to Superman's masculinity, and that's Lex Luthor. Let's take a look at this scene, because we hear about who Clark is from his two father figures, and we also get to hear about who Lex Luthor is from his father figure. Luthor is in his underground lair, and he holds up the front page of the Daily Planet. He says, "At last, it's official. Thanks to the generous help of the United States government, we are about to be involved in the greatest real estate swindle of all time." Eve, one of Lex Luthor's lackeys, who is leaning against the piano, says, "Lex, what is this obsession with real estate?" "All the time, land, land, land." Luthor says, "Miss Taskmacher, when I was 6 years old, my father said to me," and Eve cuts in, "Get out." Luthor goes on, "Ha ha ha. Before that, he said, son, stocks may rise and fall, utilities and transportation systems may collapse. People are no damn good, but they will always need land, and they'll pay through the nose to get it. Remember, my father said." And Otis, one of Lex Luthor's other lackeys, says, "Land." Luthor says, "Right. It's a pity that he didn't see from such humble beginnings how I've created this empire." Eve goes, "An empire, this?" And Luthor says, "Miss Taskmacher, how many girls do you know who have a Park Avenue address like this one?" Eve sarcastically says, "Park Avenue address? 200 feet below?" Luthor points upwards. "Do you realize what people are shelling out up there for a few miserable rooms off a common elevator?" Luthor and Otis both in unison say, "What more could anyone ask?" So in this scene, we get some insight into the type of masculinity that Lex Luthor is ascribing to, and it's a very, very selfish one. It's one that was taught to him by his father. And there's this generational cycle that we see in the characters of Superman, where these traits are passed down from person to person. And Lex has learned that he has to look out for himself and kind of screw everybody else over. And it's very funny that in this scene, Luthor is kind of emasculated by Eve, who undermines his argument even as he attempts to flaunt his power for her. So in that way, you're seeing the gender dynamics between this character and his lackey be thrown against each other and kind of upended by one another. Additionally, in the meta sense, and this is kind of a funny thing to bring up because it's not necessarily originally intentioned, but it does come across this way given the final product. But Gene Hackman refused to shave his head or accommodate a bald cap at all to play the famously bald character of Lex Luthor. This ironically leads him to an even more masculinely diminished and feminine characterization for Luthor, because it's then shown that to cope with his baldness, Lex Luthor wears wigs, a traditionally feminine accessory, and this implies an insecurity in his appearance that also suggests like a weakness of spirit, and that's not very masculine of him to have this huge insecurity about his physical appearance, So that irony, I think, feeds into the characterization in a very interesting way that ultimately is for the better of the film, even if it makes it a kind of a worse depiction of the character of Lex Luthor. So, as we've discussed, Superman's version of masculinity is one that champions protection, which is a very traditionally masculine trait, but it goes hand in hand with passivity whenever possible. He avoids conflict, preferring to put others' needs before his own in all things. He is gentle, he is honest whenever he can be, and his compassion is seen by the narrative not as a failure of his strength, but as a heroic trait necessary to his very character. I'm a big fan of stories which allow different supporting characters to take on varying perspectives on the same thematic subject matter in order to put the differing viewpoints in opposition to one another and create a dialogue. It's something that I try to do in my own writing. And I think Superman is an excellent example of one such story, especially since the characters are able to talk about masculinity and femininity without ever really talking explicitly about those things. It's all done through the audience's observation of the characters in their natural state. So if you ask me, what was Superman about? I would say the flexible definition of masculinity and the importance of kindness. Thanks for being here. Feel free to rate the show wherever you're listening. You can watch video versions of the podcast as well as find clips from the film I've talked about today on my social media and YouTube pages. Just visit whatwastthataboutpodcast.com. From there, you can follow me wherever you like. Instagram, Letterboxd, you name it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.